Welcome to the Spiral of the Rose podcast with our friends Kelli and Bri.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Spiral of the Rose podcast. Today we decided that we wanted to talk about shadows. Now, when we're recording this, we are like in the depths of eclipse season. It was the eclipse yesterday, and when it comes to eclipses, they go perfectly hand in hand with shadows. So we decided that we wanted to choose this topic for this time for that reason. And it's applicable all the time. We're all, we all have our shadows. We all have the things that we have to look at there. But especially for eclipse season, we just thought it was so appropriate. So we're going to talk about, first of all, what is a shadow? So a lot of people have misconceptions around what a shadow is. And I think there's also just different opinions, different perspectives, right? So to me, a shadow is just a hidden part of ourselves. There's no bad or good attached to it. And for a lot of people, shadows equal scary. Shadows equal bad or evil, or like they're hidden for a reason because they're so bad. And like, if we're going to work on our shadows or work through our shadows, it is this idea of like, we're fixing something about ourselves, where to me, it's more just the unacknowledged pieces. And the difference, I think, just comes from where the judgment of it is coming from. So when I looked at it, it's like there's hidden pieces because they were judged by other people or myself. When a lot of people look at it, they're going, they're hidden pieces because we don't want to look at them because they're awful, right? So it's just removing that judgment from it, I think, when it comes to the way that I look at shadows. So our shadows just being hidden parts of ourselves, things that maybe we haven't wanted to look at because of fear of judgment, things that we hid when we were really young, especially when we're children. We don't even realize we're doing it. We just decide like, this is a part of myself that nobody seems to like, so I'm going to put that away for now, right? We choose not to behave the way we were behaving, embody personality traits that we had, embody our gifts that we had, all of these kinds of things. So we hide, psychic abilities. We hide outspokenness, especially as girls. This one's so common, right? And we hide, for me, one of my biggest ones was my girliness, right? I was like, I wish that I was a boy because boys get to do everything. Boys are allowed to do whatever. They're allowed to be jerks. They're allowed to this and that and the other thing. And I have to be so prim and proper. So for me, it was like, hide the girl, right? And not in a change my sex kind of way, not in any of that, but just in a like, I do not like pink. I do not want frills. I do not want lace. I do not want any of it, right? Like I was just like, nope, I don't like any of that. And it's funny because my mom tells me, so in the Mormon church, we would call what you would say like the Holy Spirit, we call it like the Holy Ghost. Okay. And that actually sounds really funny to me when I like compare the two. I'm like, why do you call it that? That's so weird. But I liked pink so much when I was really little, like 1 and 2 kind of thing, that I said that I had a pink Holy Ghost. Okay. So the extremity of that to where I put that love of pink, I buried that so deeply and gave myself the story that I hated pink to the extent that I still can't stand it. I still don't like pink. Right. And so that's how extreme it can go. And it can be over something so seemingly ridiculous as liking or not liking a color. Right. So all the way up to like, I see dead people kind of thing, right? Like we can literally, it could be anything. It's anything that we perceived as being judged, therefore not being safe to talk about, not being safe to look at or think about or any of it. So we bury it in our subconscious We hide it away just to look at it. And so that is what I would call a shadow. That shadow is not necessarily actually a bad thing, right? So that is my understanding of it. Now, I know that Kelli had a very different understanding, and many, many people do. When we first were sort of talking and hanging out and everything like that. So Kelli, why don't you tell us about how you looked at it from the beginning?
Yeah, so yeah, it's super interesting because when Brie and I met, we were both like in more of the beginning parts of our spiritual journeys. But for me, it was like when I started exploring everything, I was willing to look at the light side of it. But when it came to the shadows, that I kind of had this preconceived sort of fear that shadows were something dark, that they were something that I didn't want to be working with, that they would sort of consume me, that they would take me over, that they would do all these things. And so I had to sort of dig deep to why I believed in that. Why did I believe that, right? Where did that come from? And so I did a lot of work around like just kind of examining like, why do I have this fear of shadows? And for me, it did come from that like religious programming, because a lot of the times in the Catholic Church, which I grew up in, they really put an emphasis on the devil was evil, and I associated like Satan or the devil or like all of those things with shadows and with the dark side. They always said that this is the dark side. And that was kind of like, it's funny because it was kind of reinforced by popular culture as well for me, because I watched a lot of horror movies as a kid, which they always emphasized in those, like, and they even had I even remember some movies where it was like the religious people fighting against these evil dark things, right? Like, so it was like there's always
with
this
light specifically.
with
It would be
light.
like, I'm shining a light on you and it burns your eyes, right? Like,
So it was always this contrast that I was seeing. So I really had to examine that. And it wasn't until Brie came in when she was sharing these things about shadows and her shamanism work. And I started getting interested by that. And I actually joined a few classes that she had taken and just started learning more about these things, that I was able to kind of see it differently and understand, in which the way she was explaining it at the beginning of this episode, where a shadow is more of a hidden part of yourself. So for me, it took a little while to distinguish that and to kind of get through that programming, which happens a lot to a lot of us, right? I feel that's so common that we come in with these different preconceived notions. And even last week, we were talking about the stuff with the witch and the preconceived notions of the witch wound and, persecution of witches. So there's all of these different ideas that we just come in with these preconceived notions from our our histories, our families, like programming, society, all types of different influences, right? So
well, and I think like the witch wound ties into this a lot in all reality, right? There's again, like I mentioned in the last episode, there's collective wounds that we all sort of feel from the generations of this persecution. And then there's on top of that, like you said, there's our family programming, our society programming, religious programming, all of the things that we grew up with, right? And everybody's experience is unique, so they're all a little bit different. I find it so funny, like you talk about watching all these horror movies, and I was the opposite. I was absolutely terrified of everything. So like I was saying before we hopped on here, like I got so scared watching like Jurassic Park and Casper and things. Like I just was big, and I still am. I hate horror movies. I will not watch them. I actually had like, back when I still was pretty religious, I was watching, I was with a bunch of friends and they put on The Exorcist, and I'm watching that, and
I like that one.
And normally for me, if I do start a scary movie, I have to finish it because my imagination is worse than the movie. With that movie, I was like, this feels evil. This feels awful. I don't want to finish this. I'm scared out of my mind, right? And I left the room and I literally was like crying and praying and like, God, take this away from me. Like, I don't want to remember this. I don't want to think about this. I was like, I promise I'll never watch another scary movie if you take this away from me. So I made a deal with God, right? So I was like, nope, I do not watch. I will not watch scary movies anymore. I absolutely refuse. I'm like, they put negative shit in my brain, right? So I'm like, nope, I don't need that. And for me, it's less about like there are some that could maybe be considered scary, more like the Halloween ones or, stuff like that, where I'm like, they're not so bad. But the ones with twisted shit, that's the stuff that I refuse to watch now. So I'll watch
the same way now. Yeah. I don't like to watch those.
I feel that they put really negative energy on us, right? Mm-hmm. So I specifically avoid those. I tell my kiddo to avoid them. She loves scary stuff. So I'm like, I'll give you your freedom of choice, right? But I'm like, there's been a few times where she's experiencing, like she's having nightmares or she's having, and I'm like, what did you watch? What did you watch?
Yeah.
Right. And she knows the rule in my house, like, you don't watch any of that twisted shit in my house. Like, go to your friend's house and then it's your choice, but you don't watch that here. That energy is just not allowed in my space. So anyways, that's a little bit of a sidetrack, but I find that so funny. Like, we're complete opposites in that way. And I was raised with that whole concept of like dark equals evil, which is, it's really interesting as I dive more into the path of the rose, really, the divine feminine. The divine feminine is equated with darkness. So this is very tied into what we talked about last episode, right? So divine feminine is more like the moon versus the sun is divine masculine. So like, as far as energies go. So the darkness is this flowy, quiet, tuning inward space for the feminine. And it makes perfect sense. But again, like we were talking about last time, the patriarchy, colonialism, religions came in and were like, the dark is bad because we're persecuting divine feminine healers, right? So it all fits so perfectly.
When you were saying,
and I will say, I totally had that fear of the dark.
When you were saying that, what came to mind with the dark space of the feminine was the womb space. Like, because the womb,
literally, that's where creation is from.
Literally, that's where creation is from. They just sent me a message saying to say that out loud. So the womb space is the dark space where we cultivate babies, where we cultivate projects that we're birthing into the world, where everything is born of there, and it is a dark but safe space, right? So that's there. Like, going back to what we were talking about last week, where we're connected, everything is connected in nature, in our bodies, and as women, and as the feminine. And it just boggles my mind how we see these examples again and again in the physical.
Yeah. And I think like it's so fascinating and it's so frustrating all at once to be like, look how much they twisted things so that people wouldn't believe, right? So like, literally to the point of us being scared of the dark. Now, I do agree that evil can happen in the dark more easily. It's easier to hide evil in the dark. However, darkness in and of itself is not evil, right? I did have fear of the dark. My dad would like hide in the dark and make me jump out of my skin, like scare the crap out of me or whatever. Like, and he thought it was hilarious. I thought it was terrifying, things like that when I was a kid. So there's all kinds of things that had me scared of the dark in that sense. And, we're taught, especially as women, and this is reasonable in the toxic masculine environment that we live in, but we're taught as women, especially, not to walk alone at night, not to be out alone in the dark, right? To keep ourselves safe. And that is, like I said, it's reasonable in this day and age. We have to sort of follow that to literally keep our physical safety. But now I love going outside in my yard where it's safe, right? In the dark and standing out with my feet in the grass and looking up at the sky and moonlight, looking at the stars, like all of that kind of thing. That energy is so beautiful. And I'm not terrified just being outside anymore. I'm not terrified, you know, when I'm in the basement and I turn the light off behind me before I go upstairs, I'm not like bolting up the stairs like a gunshot went off, right? Like I used to just run. I'd be so scared, right? And it's funny though, like as I came into the healing communities, the spiritual communities, all of that, and shadows, quote unquote, came up, and it was like, this is something you have to work on, shadow work, and you know, all of this. That didn't scare me right off the bat. My perception of it right away was those hidden pieces. So it wasn't like, and also I think a piece of that is just my way of doing everything, of like diving in head first, no fear, right? Leap off the cliff, like just that's just how I roll. So I was maybe less scared to try it out in the beginning, and found out very quickly how much it benefited me to do that work, right? So as much as yes, it can be it can be a lot. It's yeah, I really had no fear of it, and have no fear of it, even with the difficulty that it can bring. So I love that distinction. I love, again, like we can come from all these different perspectives, right? It's so interesting, the different backgrounds that we come from. And for me, because literally I went from nothing to 100, right? 0 to 100 in my spiritual journey. It was like an overnight thing. I left my husband, and then in that next week, when he had my kids and they were gone camping, I was meditating and heard, "You are a shaman," right? So it was like this instant switch into, then I'm like, what is that? And I'm diving into it. I finally found my teacher, like within a week of that, found my shamanic teacher and met her, and she was starting the first round of like level 1 training right away, and all of these things. And so then I dove right in, right? I went for it, and I plunged myself into, and I'm really noticing this right now, a dark night of the soul for like a couple of years. I just realized we're calling it a dark night of the soul. We're still putting that negativity on the dark, right? When we call it that, like, geez. So yeah, I definitely found that, especially the shamanic path, you know, there's a lot of, in the healing and spiritual communities, there's a lot of light oriented healing. There's a lot of, we call them light workers. We call it, like, people will say love and light, love and light, love and light, right? That's a really common phrase. And I went down the shamanic path, so it was a little darker. It was a little more shadow oriented than probably a lot of the other paths.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you look at Reiki, a lot of the time it's a light focused thing, right? It's angel light Reiki, or even yours, right? It's holy fire. Fire is light, right? It's like they always seem to have that light aspect. And shamanism is, again, when we take away the association with dark equals bad, but shamanism is a much darker path, right? It's a much more shadowy path. It is you know, things like mediumship and all of that kind of fall under that umbrella. And
that's kind of a good transition, because I had a thought when you were talking about shadows around your spiritual gifts, and like hiding them and keeping them hidden because of the perceptions of what others would think if you came out and said, "I can talk to dead people," or whatever.
yeah.
They probably like, "You're crazy," like as an 8-year-old, right? Like whatever.
Yeah.
Like but for me, like that was a big important part, and I'm even uncovering things recently, talking to my mom about my childhood, and just like this is a continuous journey of relearning for me. And
Yeah.
you know, one of the biggest shadows was suppressing some of those gifts that I now realize I did have. I did in fact have those gifts as a child, but thinking back, they more so scared me because of all the outside influences that were coming in.
Yeah.
So they were suppressed. And it's not like my mom purposely suppressed them, because
Mm.
she's very open to all of this. You know, we her
Yeah.
talk about it a lot now, and she's always been open to sort of, you know, she believes in a lot of the same things I do about the spirit world. And just like we've had these conversations recently, and it's been really enlightening to just kind of see how much like the school and outside influences and like society itself influenced me to kind of shut some of that stuff down. Not necessarily my parents, but like the
Yeah.
outside part of
Yeah.
it, you know? And so, like, yeah, that has been recently. It even took me up until now, like in the past couple of months, to open myself up to realizing that I may have more of these mediumship gifts than I realized. And one of the biggest catalysts recently was my dog passing away, because I felt like I could instantly communicate with him when he passed
Yeah.
over. And I was like, wow, like this is incredible. Like I've never had my eyes this wide open to this gift before. But just that intense love I had for him, I think allowed me to more clearly be able to have that line of communication open.
Yeah, like be comfortable to have it, right? Because
Yeah,
how could something or someone that you loved so much be scary, right?
exactly.
So, and I think for me, it's really interesting. Like I think as far as the gifts go, at least in the Mormon church, I don't know about really with other ones, but we actually like there's a lot of, I mean, we believe in the afterlife. So we believe that people's spirits stick around, right? We believe all of that. They don't necessarily believe um in like multiple like past lives and stuff like that, but they do believe
Correct.
that like your spirit sticks around, you were here before you were in your body, like all of that kind of stuff. And I think like I grew up with a lot of stories like when I was a baby, there was a night I was a pretty happy, like content baby, but there was a night when I don't know if I was sick or what. Like we were just in a phase, right? Where I was like crying all night, would not sleep. Um, and my parents were lying in bed going like, okay, it's my turn, I'll go. And the other one was like, no, no, it's my turn, I'll go. And they're just both lying there and like so exhausted, couldn't even get up to go get me and try to get me to stop crying, right?
Yeah.
And they're just kind of like going back and forth like that. And my mom always tells it, like she goes, Heavenly Father, she's your child too. Can't you do something kind of a thing, right? And it was just like praying to God to help, right? And all of a sudden she heard a woman's voice singing to me. And she recognized the voice. I think she said it was like her aunt or something like that, um, who had passed previously. And I immediately settled and went to sleep and slept the rest of that night. That kind of story is the kind of story I grew up with. So it was normalized in that sense
Yeah.
that like there could be interaction like that. It wasn't normalized in the sense of like, oh, I walk around and I can see them all over all the time. Like it wasn't
Right.
to that extreme, but it was these interactions do happen. The worlds can touch kind of thing, right? So that part was normalized for me and not made scary. But I think for me, like looking at it, I'm wondering like, why did I bury those gifts? Because same, right? Mediumship has been a really strong one for me where I'm like, and I resisted it so hard. And I think we're going to have a separate episode about that, maybe even next. But I resisted that too. And I think the reasoning behind that, even though I had that acceptance of the spirit world and everything like that, I think the reasoning behind that is again the religious piece of the devil and evil and dark. And on top of that, the patriarchal aspect to it again. And it almost feels like I'm harping on this, but at the same time, it really was saturated through everything, right? So in the Mormon church, men could hold what you call the priesthood, which would be like a spiritual healing gift, a spiritual power. Women were not allowed. So like they were not allowed to have that. So if I was experiencing being able to call in that spiritual gift as a woman. And I will say this, I think I had a misconception about it. Like I just didn't completely understand it as a child. My mom, the way she talks about it now, when I have these conversations with her, is like, well, no, like women just access it differently. Right. And then we've had these conversations to the point where I'm like, oh my gosh, women access it naturally. A woman's intuition is a thing, right? It's like this big deal, and men don't naturally do that as easily. So it was the situation was more of men had to be given this priesthood power where women just sort of naturally embody it. So that gave me a huge perspective shift on it, right? But when I was a kid, I perceived it as like men have these powers and women don't, right? So it was like, because they were the only ones allowed to perform like the ceremony type stuff was the men. So for me, I think that I probably, again, I don't think that my mom or dad or anybody ever said like, what the hell's wrong with you? Like you see dead people kind of a thing. I think that I just buried it really young because I was like, women aren't supposed to be able to do this.
Yeah.
I really think that was probably just me interpreting my surroundings. Right. So, because I don't remember there ever being a specific situation where someone was like, you're a freak. That doesn't work for us. Like, be quiet.
No, right.
Don't talk about none of that. Right. I don't think that was ever a thing. And I didn't have a problem believing that it existed ever, because again, I was raised with all of these experiences like that. And that like, that literally is just one. There's so many stories from my childhood of stuff like that. So it was at least very normalized in that sense.
Yeah, for me, similar too. You know, my mom talked about the spirit world a lot. Like I started to remember a lot of different things as I've been exploring as an adult, and I'll ask her as it comes up, and she will tell me, yeah, I always had those beliefs, and she's like, I didn't really hide them from you. And but I think that, like you were saying, the outside perspectives are what scared me, not what was she was sharing with me. Like, you know, because she would share just like a benevolent spirit visited her or something, you know, like a family member, and it was all very benevolent. It wasn't bad, it wasn't evil, it was just a loving presence. And she would talk about that, but the fear from like the outside stuff would creep in, and I would just be like, oh my gosh, ghosts, like I was scared, you know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, from like movies.
She never talked about like in a bad way ever. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I did have experiences, actually more my brothers, but like they told their stories around having not very benevolent spirits come and have those interactions as well. So I knew that both sides were possible.
Right.
And I guess I was always taught that I was protected, that angels were surrounding us, that, you know, like, and again, the men in the household would put a protection on the house. They would call in the angels to protect our home, apartment, or whatever that I ever moved to. I had my dad or my brother or somebody come and bless my house and call in the angels, put them around it, you know, all of that kind of stuff. Now I do that for myself. Yeah. Right. but back then I would always just call them to do it. I also had, like, as a young adult, after I had Cadence, living on my own as a single mom, I had spirits I could hear in my place, and I was like terrified. I was like, why can I hear this? This is so creepy. Yeah. And I would then call them in and be like, come get rid of these spirits out of my house. And they would, and it worked, and, you know, all of those things. So I'm like, none of that, it was never a not believing thing for me, but I was like, why would I want to talk to dead people when mediumship came up? Right. I was like, I don't know. Anyway. Yeah. So I found like shamanism just in general was very shadow oriented. And again, I'm a leap off the cliff, dive in head first, like go all in. It doesn't matter if it's hard, like that's how I am. So I did. And I think the biggest thing when it comes to shadow work, that anybody needs to know is that it's really about self-trust. I think that you have to learn that you're capable, you're able to hold it, right? You're able to handle it. And I really do believe that anyone is able to handle it. However, I will put that like stipulation in there that like, if you feel unsupported, if you don't have a network, if you don't have someone to talk to, like it can get to the point where you're not choosing to handle it. And I call it a choice because I'm all about radical responsibility. But it feels too overwhelming. And so you choose to give up. Right. So, when I say everyone can handle it, I don't mean that in a disempowering, like if you're struggling, you're not, you're wrong or you're bad in some way. If you're struggling, reach out to somebody, get help. Right. Absolutely. Like that is not intended as like an insult to anyone who's struggling with it, because it is hard. It is absolutely hard. And, like I said, I was plunged into like a 2-year dark night of the soul. That basically, it was like 2 years that were really freaking hard. Right. So I get it. I get how hard it can be. And I just think that I want everybody to try to lean into that feeling of like, I've got this, I can do this. There's always a way. Be solution oriented, right? Be resourceful, find the supports that you need. They are out there, and learn to trust yourself. Because when it comes to shadow work, that's really what it was all about. Learning to trust that being a girl was actually powerful, right? Like girl power, right? Like to me, that was like, like, but I have now learned like women are freaking powerful, and a woman's intuition is an incredible thing. And all of these, but those for me were as scary to dive into as people can talk to dead people. Like
Yeah.
they really were just as scary for me.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that people should really lean into is that these shadows come up whether you are actively trying to uncover them or not. And sometimes, if they come up and you don't have a network of support or a community of support or people you can go to say, hey, like, what is your experience? What are your tips for this? If you're just doing this alone and those shadows come up anyways, that's going to be harder on you. So it's always like, to me, just pointing out to people that, we do have these communities of support. Brianna has this big Facebook group of support. I have a Facebook group. We both have our resources and programs and support and sessions and like all of these things to help people. And even just to reach out and ask a question, we can answer a question and just, help people. But all that to say, it's just like, no matter how much people want to suppress certain shadows or to just ignore that they're there and not deal with them and push them away, they're gonna come back up eventually. So like, it's better to just recognize them and move through them as they come up.
Yeah. Resisting them makes it so much harder. The more you allow them to come up and to be processed. And this is so tied in, which is exactly what I was about to say too. It's so tied in with emotion, right? If we feel our emotions and we let it go through us, it doesn't last as long. If we resist it, it sticks around, right? If we bury it, it's still there. So it's the same idea as that. And that is exactly what I was going to say, because yesterday on the eclipse day, you and I were having these conversations, and one of my biggest shadows that I still am very much struggling with, I still, have a hard time trusting, is emotion, is allowing myself to feel the emotions and allowing them to process through, and not judging them. Right. That is one of the hardest ones for me, because so many of us, like, we're taught to just bury that. Nobody wants to feel it. Nobody wants to hear it. Like, stop whining, stop crying, all of those kinds of messages that we received growing up. And I had this one coming up big time yesterday, and it was like message after message after message all day yesterday. I don't want to look at that. My kids' emotions get me triggered, all of these kinds of things. And it was like, what is the specific shadow that's coming up for me to be released in this eclipse season? Emotion. It's like, and like, you know, we were talking about south node to north node and how you're releasing. The south node is like your past lives, your past, and the stuff that you're moving away from. Your north node is the stuff you're moving towards. Well, my north node is Pisces, or is in Pisces, which is a water sign, right? It's all about emotion. And so I'm moving towards that acceptance of emotion, right? And it's not even so much like a fear of that emotion. It's just this total not knowing how to handle it, right? Like just having no idea. So that is right now, like that's my current big shadow that's coming up to be worked through, right? And allowed and accepted. And that's okay. That piece right there, that word accepted, is key when it comes to shadows, because we subconsciously chose to bury them. That's why they're shadows. So for us to integrate, quote unquote, our shadows, or to heal, as a lot of people say, heal our shadows. Again, to me, I don't think that we're fixing something that's wrong with us. I think that we are learning to accept all the parts and pieces of ourselves, right? So when that comes up, it's an acceptance. When there's a shadow, it's learning to accept it fully and just love it as it is. Not fix it, but love it as it is. And that is how you integrate your shadows. That is how you bring them to, quote unquote, light. And again, I don't think that that is light in the sense of like light is better than dark, but just light in the sense of awareness, right? So and like being able to see it. Yeah. So and then I know, like, for you, on even with all of that background and everything, like I would think a witch would totally get shadows. But you were even saying, even though you're a witch, like it was, and like even before you really got to the point where you were like willing to look at shadows, you were already a witch at that point, but it's still was a sticking point for you.
So it's interesting because for me, it was like when I rediscovered witchy roots and really connected in with that type of path. I didn't at that time, I wasn't like actively exploring shadows. For me, it was more about identifying like that piece of me that I had lost, or that I, was a part of me in past lives, or even through this lifetime, or, generationally. I felt that piece of me had to be reintegrated. But now thinking back on it, that was a little bit of shadow work, right? Reintegrating that piece of me that was lost. That is shadow work. But for me, like, I didn't want to work with like dark goddesses, or like Lilith, or like even Persephone, or I didn't want to work with those energies, because I felt like it was going to unearth things too quickly that I couldn't handle. That was my perspective on it back then. Like, I felt like, oh, if I start working with these energies, and if I start doing all of this, it's just gonna like keep unearthing all this stuff and throw me into this path that right now I feel like I cannot handle. So that was my sort of thinking around it. So yeah, it is interesting. Like, a lot of people will associate being a witch with darkness, or with, shadow work, or with different things like that. But that perception is very skewed as well.
Yeah, that is true. Like, the more I obviously, like, now that I know you, it is skewed, because for you it is very green and light and earthy energies versus shadow and darkness. And that again is that perception of like witches being evil, right? So and tying that in with the dark. And if witches are working in the dark, it's because they're working with those divine feminine energies, not not evil necessarily, right? Obviously there are exceptions to every rule. And I think the one thing that you said that stuck out to me there was like, you were talking about, it took you a long time to be comfortable working with those darker goddesses, like Lilith and all of that. For me, it's the opposite. I just realized that, and I never thought about that, but I have a harder time working with like the love goddesses and the, like the more girly, more like not more feminine, more girly, but like more those lighter aspects. I'm like, they're just frou-frou. Like, I don't need that. Like, that's sort of more the perspective where it's like, like that's not important. I need to focus on this serious stuff over here.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Like, I never realized that until right at this moment. So that's very fascinating.
That is super interesting. Yeah. Even recently, I started working with Kuan Yin, and she's she's the mother of self-compassion. And working with her, like, it's very interesting because she is perceived as very much a lighter goddess, like love, love, compassion. But she's also very like no nonsense. Like, you are going to love yourself. You are going to give yourself this self-compassion. Like, I'm not giving you an option right now. So it's very interesting just seeing those different energies, come into play, and how even the ones that are perceived as love and light, are perceived as this loving energy, they are still coming from that dark feminine space, that intuition, that place within us that is guiding us, that is our ever guiding source, that is our ever guiding source that we're unearthing. So it's all like, it is very interesting once you get into all the different types of energies.
Yeah. Well, as you were saying that, I was kind of realizing too, these, what we're calling them goddesses, and some people might take that as like, these are different energy archetypes, whatever, stuff like that. But the way I kind of look at it is like, we are all on this ladder of learning and growth, and they're like maybe higher up the ladder, they've experienced more of this, whatever. But when it comes to goddesses in general, I feel like that is kind of, there's one, it's all about perception. They're perceived as light and love, and then these other ones are perceived as dark goddesses. And in all reality, they all have both sides, because they are that more advanced energy or being that has integrated both sides, right? So they've got both pieces. So like Lilith is a great example of that. She's so perceived as like darkness, but in all reality, Lilith has a lot to do with empowerment and standing up for ourselves and all of these. And that's a pretty light energy, right? Like, that's a really great thing.
Yeah.
And like, so there's both sides, and it's all really about the perception. And I have also, you suggested Kuan Yin to me recently when I needed to have some self-compassion. Like, I have worked with these other energies, and they are not all just, they're not at all, actually, I should say, frou-frou. they're all very high energy one way or another. So yeah, I think that, I just think that's incredible. And it's so fascinating, and we could talk about it forever, but I love shadow work. And, a lot of people will be like, oh, it's time for shadow work. Oh my gosh. And me, I'm like, let's go. Right? Like, that's perfect. Let's go. Let's get that dealt with. Let's look at that. And I have learned, however, to put like a pause in it when I need to take a break from constant healing. But like beyond that, I'm like, I really do love my shadow work. So I could talk about this all day. But I think that really the key thing here is just, it's important to look at our shadows. It's important to learn about and uncover all the aspects of ourselves, all the pieces of ourselves, and to develop that self-trust that we can handle it. I think that is one of the biggest, most important parts of the human journey is to do that. So that's probably why it's one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So as you were talking, I glanced over at an oracle card I pulled yesterday, and there's an image on it, and it's called self-reflection, and she's looking at herself in the mirror. And so I think that like just connected right now for me, I just connected that to shadow work. Like, shadow work is like the biggest self-reflection that you can do in your life. And really, if you look at it like that and take away the pre-programmed aspects that you might have thought were scary, and think of it as this deep self-reflection of what are you examining within yourself, what are you unearthing, what are you exploring, and just take it as that type of journey. I think that would help people, take away those other negative connotations around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for anyone who is sort of diving into shadow work and a little bit uncertain, again, whether you believe in goddesses per se or just different energy archetypes and stuff like that, highly recommend Kuan Yin energy when you're working with shadow work, because that self-compassion is key, and accepting yourself for having hidden these things in the first place and not beating yourself up over it. So highly recommend that. Thank you, Kelli, for pointing that out to me when I was dealing with some lately. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think after this one, we are going to have our first guest episode, which is really exciting. And we'll be talking all about mediumship, and that one will be released right around Halloween, which is like perfect timing. So I'm really excited to talk about that. But thank you all for listening today, and we will talk to you next time.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like it and subscribe. And if you really loved it, we would love a 5-star review, which helps us reach more people with our message. Comment your thoughts on the episode below, or if you have any questions you'd like us to answer in a future episode. Talk to you next time.